In the quiet spaces of the brain, where thoughts form before they are noticed and intentions gather before they become actions, a simple chemical signal moves steadily from cell to cell. It arrives without sound or sensation, no glow, no feeling. And yet, over time, it shapes what feels interesting, what feels worth pursuing, and what quietly fades into the background. For many years, this signal was spoken about as if it were a reward in itself, a spark of pleasure, a moment of happiness, something that arrives when life goes well. But modern neuroscience has revealed a subtler story. Dopamine is less about enjoyment and more about direction, less about satisfaction and more about anticipation. It does not tell the brain that something feels good. It tells the brain that something matters. Welcome to the Sleepy Scientist. If drifting through quiet questions like this brings a sense of calm, you're very welcome to subscribe and join these explorations. And if it feels right, sharing where in the world you're listening from tonight is always appreciated. A small reminder of how far these thoughts can travel. So, let's begin. Using imaging tools capable of observing living neural activity, researchers have watched dopamine rise not at the moment of reward, but just before it. As expectations form, as predictions sharpen, as the brain leans gently toward what might come next. In many cases, the signal fades the moment the reward actually arrives, leaving behind a strange quiet where excitement once lived. This simple shift in timing changes how everyday life begins to look. Motivation no longer appears as a product of willpower alone. Habits no longer feel entirely chosen. Restlessness, boredom, and the urge to keep moving forward start to reveal a common thread. Beneath them all, dopamine quietly tracks patterns, learns probabilities, and nudges attention toward what it believes is worth repeating. These systems are ancient. Long before screens, schedules, or modern distractions, dopamine helped organisms learn where food appeared, which paths were safe, and when effort was likely to pay off. The brain did not evolve to make anyone constantly satisfied. It evolved to keep attention moving, searching, adjusting. In a world filled with uncertainty, that forward pull was often the difference between survival and silence. In the modern world, those same mechanisms remain intact. The chemistry has not changed, even though the environment has. Signals arrive faster. Novelty appears endlessly. Rewards are hinted at more often than they are delivered. And the brain, doing exactly what it was built to do, responds by wanting again, and again, and again. This does not mean anything is broken. It means the system is working precisely as designed. Dopamine does not ask whether a pursuit is meaningful. It asks whether it has been reinforced. It does not weigh long-term fulfillment against short-term interest. It simply records what happened last time and adjusts expectations for the next. Tonight's exploration moves slowly through that landscape, not to judge it, not to control it, but to understand it, to follow dopamine as it shapes motivation, attention, habit, and desire, to notice the difference between signals that sustain and signals that exhaust, and to gently untangle the idea that wanting more is a personal failure rather than a biological pattern. Along the way, familiar experiences may begin to feel less mysterious. The quiet drop after finishing something long anticipated, the strange pull toward distractions that no longer feel rewarding, the sense of being driven without quite knowing why. These are not flaws, they are signatures, traces left behind by a learning system that never truly stops scanning the future. Understanding dopamine does not mean mastering it. It does not offer a switch to turn off desire or a shortcut to constant calm. What it offers instead is perspective, a way to see behaviour not as a reflection of character, but as the outcome of signals, timing, and repetition unfolding beneath awareness. As this journey continues, there is no need to take notes or draw conclusions. The ideas are meant to drift in gently, one at a time, to settle where they may, to offer clarity without urgency. For now, let attention rest. Let curiosity soften, and allow the quiet chemistry of the brain to reveal itself, slowly. Dopamine is often spoken about as if it were a feeling, a rush, a spark of pleasure, a kind of internal applause when something goes well. But inside the brain, dopamine is none of those things. It does not feel like anything at all. It has no emotional texture of its own. It is instead a messenger, a small chemical signal that passes quietly between brain cells, carrying information rather than emotion. To understand dopamine properly, it helps to picture the brain not as a single thinking organ, but as a vast network of individual cells. Each of these cells, called neurons, is separated from the next by a tiny gap. They do not touch. Information crosses that gap using chemical messengers released by one cell and received by another. Dopamine is one of those messengers. It is what neuroscientists call a neurotransmitter, a substance whose job is to transmit signals across those microscopic spaces. When a neuron releases dopamine, it is not creating pleasure or motivation in a direct sense. It is sending a signal that something important has happened or is about to happen. That signal changes how the receiving neuron behaves. It might become more likely to fire again. It might strengthen a connection. It might adjust how future signals are interpreted. Over time, these small adjustments shape patterns of thought and behaviour, even though the person experiencing them never feels dopamine itself. This is where confusion often begins. Because dopamine is involved in reward, learning, and motivation, it is easy to assume that dopamine is the reward. But chemically, that is not the case. Pleasure, enjoyment, and satisfaction involve many systems working together, including other neurotransmitters and brain regions. Dopamine's role is more subtle. It marks significance. It highlights what should be noticed, remembered, or repeated. One way to think about dopamine is as a highlighter rather than a reward. When dopamine is released, the brain is being told quietly and efficiently that something matters, that something might be food, novelty, progress, or even the possibility of a future outcome. The signal does not say whether that thing is good or bad, healthy or unhelpful. It simply increases the likelihood that the brain will pay attention and learn from it. Brain cells are constantly communicating like this. Electrical activity moves within each cell, while chemical signals move between them. Dopamine participates in specific pathways, meaning certain routes through the brain where its influence is strongest. These pathways connect areas involved in movement, learning, motivation, and decision-making. When dopamine activity changes in these circuits, behaviour often changes as well. Sometimes in ways that feel intentional, and sometimes in ways that feel automatic. It is important to pause here and clear away one common misunderstanding. Dopamine is not a happiness chemical. Happiness is not stored in a molecule. There is no single substance that, when increased, guarantees contentment. The brain does not work in that kind of simple arithmetic. Dopamine does not create joy, and low dopamine does not automatically create sadness. Instead, dopamine helps the brain decide what to pursue, what to repeat, and what to ignore. Another misunderstanding comes from the idea that more dopamine is always better. In reality, the brain is built around balance. Dopamine levels rise and fall constantly, adjusting to context, expectation, and experience. Too little dopamine activity in certain pathways can make movement or motivation difficult. Too much activity in other pathways can make attention unstable or behaviour repetitive. The goal is not maximum dopamine, but appropriate signaling. To see why dopamine is better understood as a signal than a sensation, it helps to look at what happens when it is released. Dopamine does not flood the entire brain. It is released in specific locations, in specific amounts, at specific times. Those releases are often brief. They act more like punctuation marks than paragraphs. A small burst can strengthen a connection between neurons, making a particular pattern more likely to occur again in the future. Over time, these patterns accumulate. The brain learns what tends to lead to outcomes it considers important. This learning happens even if the outcome is no longer enjoyable, or even if it becomes actively frustrating. Dopamine does not track satisfaction. It tracks patterns and predictions. It helps the brain answer a very simple question over and over again. What should be done next? This is why dopamine is so closely tied to learning. When something turns out better than expected, dopamine signaling often increases. When something turns out worse than expected, dopamine signaling often decreases. These changes help the brain adjust its predictions. The brain is constantly comparing what it thought would happen with what actually happened, and dopamine is one of the tools it uses to update that internal model. Because of this, dopamine is deeply involved in habit formation. When a behaviour is followed by a dopamine signal, the brain becomes more likely to repeat that behaviour in similar circumstances. This happens gradually, often without conscious awareness. It does not require enjoyment, intention, or reflection. It requires repetition and signalling. Over time, actions that once felt deliberate can begin to feel automatic. This signalling role is also why dopamine is often misunderstood as motivation itself. Motivation feels like energy or drive, but dopamine is not the feeling of being motivated. It is part of the system that makes certain actions more likely to be chosen. It increases the probability that attention will shift in a particular direction. It biases decision-making gently and persistently without announcing itself. Pop culture often compresses all of this into a single phrase. Dopamine equals pleasure. Dopamine equals reward. Dopamine equals happiness. These shortcuts are understandable, but they blur important distinctions. They turn a signaling system into a sensation and a learning mechanism into an emotion. The result is a story that feels intuitive but misses what dopamine actually does. A more accurate picture is quieter and less dramatic. Dopamine is a chemical messenger that helps the brain learn from experience. It marks patterns. It adjusts expectations. It nudges behaviour. It does not decide what is meaningful in a philosophical sense. It does not evaluate whether something aligns with values or long-term well-being. It simply records what happened and prepares the brain for what might happen next. Seen this way, dopamine is neither friend nor enemy. It is not a reward to be chased or a villain to be suppressed. It is part of the machinery that allows the brain to adapt to its environment. It evolved to help organisms survive in uncertain conditions, where learning quickly from experience mattered more than feeling satisfied. In the modern world, that same machinery operates continuously, even when the environment changes faster than the brain evolved to handle. But at its core, dopamine remains what it has always been: a signal, a messenger, a quiet chemical note passed from one cell to another, shaping behaviour not through force or feeling, but through learning. Understanding dopamine in this way does not solve every question about motivation or habit, but it does replace mystery with clarity. It shifts the focus from chasing feelings to understanding signals, and it opens the door to seeing behaviour not as a reflection of character, but as the outcome of countless small messages passed through a living network, doing its best to predict what comes next. For much of modern history, dopamine has carried a reputation it never quite earned. It became known as the brain's pleasure chemical, the source of enjoyment, satisfaction, and happiness itself. The idea settled comfortably into popular understanding because it felt intuitive. When something feels good, something in the brain must be responsible. Dopamine, already associated with reward, seemed like the obvious candidate. That story did not appear out of nowhere. Early neuroscience often relied on indirect evidence. Researchers noticed that dopamine activity increased in situations involving reward. Animals worked harder for food when dopamine systems were active. Certain drugs that boosted dopamine made experiences feel more compelling. From the outside, it looked like dopamine was producing pleasure directly. But the brain rarely cooperates with simple explanations. As methods improved, especially with the ability to measure neural activity more precisely, cracks began to appear in the pleasure story. Dopamine activity did not always line up with enjoyment. In some cases, dopamine increased even when an experience was neutral, frustrating, or no longer pleasant at all. In other cases, people reported pleasure without any clear surge in dopamine. Something did not add up. The turning point came when researchers began paying close attention to timing. Instead of asking whether dopamine was present during pleasurable experiences, they asked when it appeared. What they found was subtle but important. Dopamine often peaked just before a reward, not during it. The signal rose as an outcome was anticipated, not as it was consumed. This shifted the entire picture. Imagine walking toward a bakery you enjoy. Long before the first bite, something changes. The smell reaches you down the street. You imagine the taste. Your pace might quicken without conscious effort. That sense of pull, of interest, of leaning forward into what is coming, is closely tied to dopamine activity. By the time the pastry is actually eaten, the signal has often already faded. The pleasure itself involves other systems working together. Sensory processing, emotional centers, memory, and context all contribute to enjoyment. Dopamine's role is to flag the moment as significant ahead of time. It helps prepare the brain to act, to approach, to engage. It is less like the applause at the end of a performance, and more like the rising hush just before the curtain lifts. This distinction explains why dopamine was so easily mistaken for pleasure. Anticipation often feels good. In many cases, it feels better than the reward itself. When dopamine activity rises during anticipation, the mind naturally links that feeling to enjoyment. But chemically, the signal is not producing pleasure. It is producing readiness. Everyday life is filled with examples of this. The excitement before opening a message can feel stronger than the message itself. Planning a trip can be more energizing than being on the trip. Starting a project often feels easier than finishing it. These are not personal quirks. They reflect a brain system that responds more strongly to what might happen than to what is already happening. Another reason dopamine became linked to pleasure is that it plays a role in learning from rewards. When something turns out better than expected, dopamine signaling tends to increase. That increase strengthens the connection between what happened just before and the outcome that followed. Over time, the brain learns which actions tend to lead to desirable results. From the outside, this learning looks like enjoyment-driving behaviour. Internally, it is prediction being updated. The brain is constantly making guesses about the future. When a guess turns out to be accurate, dopamine signalling changes slightly. When a guess turns out to be wrong, the signal changes in the opposite direction. These adjustments help the brain refine its expectations. Pleasure is not required for this process. Only comparison is. This helps explain why dopamine remains active even when enjoyment fades. A behaviour can become habitual long after it stops feeling good. The brain has learned that the behaviour once mattered, and the signal continues to fire out of momentum. The system is doing its job, even if the experience itself has lost its shine. Pop culture often compresses this into a simpler idea. Dopamine equals happiness, low dopamine equals sadness, high dopamine equals motivation. These shortcuts are appealing, but they flatten a complex system into a single emotional dimension. In reality, dopamine is more concerned with probability than pleasure. It tracks how likely an action is to lead to something the brain has learned to value. This also explains why chasing pleasure directly often feels unsatisfying. Dopamine is not designed to reward repetition of pleasure for its own sake. It responds most strongly to change, surprise, and improvement. When something becomes predictable, the signal quiets. Even if the experience itself remains pleasant, it no longer produces the same anticipatory response. That fading is not a failure of appreciation, it is a feature of learning. Once the brain knows what to expect, there is less need to highlight the moment. Dopamine steps back, having already done its work. Understanding this helps untangle another common misconception, the idea that more dopamine automatically means a better experience. In reality, dopamine activity can increase in stressful situations, uncertain situations, and even unpleasant ones, as long as the outcome is unpredictable or significant. The signal does not care whether the moment feels good. It cares whether the moment teaches something useful about what might happen next. This is why dopamine is better described as a system of wanting rather than liking. Wanting is forward-looking. It points attention toward the future. Liking is present-focused. It lives in the moment itself. The brain uses different systems for each. When those systems are confused, it becomes easy to believe that desire and enjoyment are the same thing. They are not. This distinction can be quietly reassuring. It explains why satisfaction sometimes feels brief and why the mind so quickly turns toward the next thing. It is not because enjoyment was inadequate. It is because the system responsible for anticipation has already moved on. Seen through this lens, dopamine is not stealing pleasure. It is simply not in charge of it. Its job is to prepare, to predict, and to learn. Pleasure arrives through other pathways, often more quietly and briefly than expected. The historical misunderstanding of dopamine makes sense. Early research tools were limited. The brain is difficult to observe, and human experience naturally links anticipation with enjoyment. But as understanding has deepened, a clearer picture has emerged. Dopamine is not the feeling of pleasure. It is the signal that points toward what might be worth pursuing. This does not make pleasure unimportant. It simply places it where it belongs. Enjoyment is something that happens in the present. Dopamine lives slightly ahead of that moment, shaping behaviour by leaning attention toward what comes next. Correcting this misconception does not require confrontation or alarm. It simply requires a shift in perspective. When dopamine is understood as a messenger rather than a reward, many everyday experiences begin to make more sense. The excitement before, the quiet after, the urge to repeat, even when repetition no longer satisfies. Dopamine was mistaken for pleasure because it often appears alongside it. But their roles are different. One teaches the brain where to look next. The other colours the moment when something finally arrives. Understanding the difference is not about losing joy. It is about seeing the machinery beneath desire with a little more clarity and a little less confusion. The brain is not built to wait passively for the world to happen. It is built to lean forward, to guess, to anticipate. Long before an event arrives, the brain is already preparing for it, quietly sketching a picture of what it thinks will come next. This ability to anticipate the future is one of the brain's most important skills. It allows movement to be coordinated, attention to be guided, and effort to be timed. Without anticipation, every moment would arrive as a surprise, and learning would be slow and inefficient. Dopamine plays a central role in this forward-looking process. not by predicting the future itself, but by helping the brain learn how accurate its predictions are. Rather than asking whether something feels good or bad, the dopamine system asks a different question. Was this better than expected, worse than expected, or about the same as expected? The answer to that question quietly shapes future behaviour. When something turns out slightly better than predicted, dopamine activity tends to increase. When something turns out worse, dopamine activity tends to decrease. When something matches expectations perfectly, the signal changes very little. Over time, these small adjustments teach the brain how reliable its predictions are. This learning happens constantly, often without awareness. Walking into a familiar room, reaching for a cup, opening an application, starting a routine. Each of these actions is guided by expectations formed through repetition. The brain is always comparing what it thought would happen with what actually happened, and dopamine helps record the difference. This difference is sometimes called a prediction gap. It is the space between expectation and reality. Dopamine does not fill that gap, it measures it. When the gap is positive, when reality slightly exceeds expectation, the signal becomes stronger. When the gap is negative, when reality disappoints, the signal weakens. Over time, the brain adjusts its expectations to reduce that gap, aiming not for constant excitement, but for accuracy. This is why surprise and novelty feel so powerful. When something unexpected happens, the prediction gap is large. The brain did not see it coming. Dopamine activity rises sharply, not because the event is necessarily pleasurable, but because it carries new information. The brain pays attention. Connections strengthen. Memory becomes more vivid. A surprise does not have to be dramatic to matter. A small change in routine, a new detail in a familiar place, a different outcome than usual. These moments stand out because they challenge the brain's predictions. Dopamine responds by highlighting them, ensuring they are noticed and remembered. Novelty works in a similar way. When something is new, the brain has no reliable model for it yet. Predictions are uncertain. Each interaction provides valuable data. Dopamine activity reflects this uncertainty, rising as the brain gathers information and slowly learns what to expect. As familiarity increases, novelty fades. Predictions become more accurate. The signal softens. This is not boredom arriving suddenly. It is the brain saying that it has learned enough for now. The forward pull quiets because the future has become predictable. This process also explains disappointment, which is often misunderstood as a purely emotional reaction. At a deeper level, disappointment is a mismatch between expectation and outcome. The brain anticipated one thing, and reality delivered another. Dopamine activity reflects that mismatch by dropping below its usual level, signaling that the prediction was too optimistic. That drop does not mean something has gone wrong. It means learning is taking place. The brain is updating its model of the world, adjusting expectations to better match reality next time. Disappointment in this sense is not failure, it is information. This can feel uncomfortable, because the system is quiet and automatic. The mind experiences the emotional result without seeing the underlying adjustment. A sense of letdown appears, even when the situation is objectively fine. The brain is simply recalibrating. This constant adjustment explains why anticipation often feels more vivid than fulfillment. Anticipation is full of uncertainty. Fulfillment resolves that uncertainty. Once the outcome is known, there is less for dopamine to signal. The future collapses into the present and the system moves on. This is not a flaw in appreciation. It is how prediction-based learning works. The brain is more interested in what it does not yet know than in what it has already experienced. Everyday life is filled with these small prediction cycles, waiting for a message, planning an event, starting something new. The mind leans forward, imagining possibilities. Dopamine activity reflects that leaning. When the moment finally arrives, the leaning stops and attention shifts elsewhere. This is why satisfaction can feel strangely brief. The brain is not built to linger. It is built to prepare for what comes next. Understanding this helps reframe motivation. Motivation is not a constant force. It rises when the future feels uncertain and promising. It fades when outcomes become predictable. Dopamine does not sustain effort indefinitely. It helps initiate it, especially when learning is still underway. This also explains why repeating the same reward rarely produces the same feeling. The first experience carries uncertainty. The second carries familiarity. By the 10th repetition, the brain already knows the outcome. Dopamine has less to contribute. Chasing the original excitement by repeating the same experience is like rereading the same surprise. The information has already been absorbed. The brain's predictive nature is not limited to rewards. It applies to effort, difficulty, and even emotional outcomes. When effort leads to improvement more than expected, dopamine activity reflects that. When effort feels wasted, the signal adjusts downward. Over time, the brain learns not just what feels good, but what seems worth the energy. This learning is deeply personal, shaped by experience rather than logic. Two people can face the same situation and predict different outcomes based on their history. Dopamine reflects those individual predictions, not objective reality. Because this process is automatic, it can sometimes feel as though the brain is pulling attention toward the future without permission. Plans form, expectations build. The mind rehearses what might happen. This is not overthinking, it is prediction at work. Seeing it this way can soften self-judgment. Anticipation is not impatience. Disappointment is not weakness. They are natural consequences of a brain that learns by comparing expectation and outcome. Dopamine sits quietly at the center of this process, not forecasting the future, but refining the brain's guesses about it. Each signal is small, each adjustment is subtle, but over time, they shape how attention moves, how effort is allocated, and how motivation rises and falls. The brain is always preparing for a future that has not yet arrived. Dopamine helps it learn how accurate those preparations are, not to create excitement for its own sake, but to make the next prediction slightly better than the last. And so the mind leans forward again, gently, endlessly, learning the shape of what might come next. Learning in the brain rarely arrives as a single moment of insight. It does not announce itself with clarity or certainty. Most of the time, learning unfolds quietly, through repetition, through small adjustments, through patterns noticed long before they are understood. Dopamine plays a central role in this slow, steady process, not as a teacher that explains, but as a signal that nudges. It does not deliver instructions, it strengthens connections. It helps the brain remember which paths were taken and which outcomes followed. At its core, learning is pattern recognition. The brain is constantly scanning for regularities. What tends to happen after this action? What usually follows that choice? Over time, these observations are woven into expectations, and expectations begin to guide behaviour. Dopamine supports this by marking moments that matter for learning. When an action leads to an outcome that differs from what was expected, dopamine activity shifts. That shift does not feel like learning. It feels like nothing at all. But inside the brain, connections are being adjusted, slightly increasing or decreasing the likelihood that the same action will be chosen again. This is often described as reinforcement learning, though the phrase can sound more technical than the process really is. Reinforcement learning simply means learning by doing and adjusting based on what follows. If a behaviour is followed by a signal that suggests the outcome was valuable or informative, the brain becomes more likely to repeat that behaviour. If not, the connection weakens. What matters most here is not how intense the experience was, but how often it occurred. A single strong experience can stand out, but it is repetition that shapes long-term behaviour. The brain trusts patterns more than moments. Dopamine reflects this trust. Small signals repeated many times gradually reshape neural pathways, while even powerful experiences fade if they are not reinforced. This is why habits form so reliably, not because each repetition feels rewarding, but because each repetition confirms a pattern. The brain learns that a certain action tends to lead to a certain outcome, and dopamine quietly strengthens that association. Over time, the behaviour becomes easier to initiate, requiring less conscious thought. This process does not require enjoyment. A behaviour can be learned even if it is neutral, inconvenient, or mildly unpleasant. As long as the pattern holds, the brain continues to reinforce it. Dopamine does not evaluate whether the behaviour is desirable in a broader sense. It only tracks whether the pattern remains consistent. Consider how many daily actions happen without deliberate choice. Reaching for a phone, taking a familiar route, opening the same application at the same time of day. These behaviours were not learned through intensity, they were learned through repetition. Dopamine helped mark the pattern, not the pleasure. This also explains why changing habits can feel difficult, even when motivation is strong. The brain is not resisting change out of stubbornness, it is relying on patterns it has learned to trust. New behaviours have not yet accumulated enough repetition to feel reliable. Dopamine signals reflect this uncertainty, offering less reinforcement until the pattern proves itself over time. Learning in this sense is conservative. The brain does not rush to rewrite its expectations. It waits for evidence. Repetition provides that evidence. This gradual shaping is especially clear when learning new skills. Early attempts often feel effortful and awkward. The brain is still mapping the relationship between action and outcome. Dopamine signals rise and fall as predictions are tested and refined. With practice, movements become smoother, decisions quicker, and effort more efficient. The skill has not suddenly improved. The pattern has simply become familiar. Importantly, dopamine does not store memories itself. It influences which connections are strengthened, making certain patterns easier to access in the future. Memory, attention, and emotion all work alongside it. Learning is a group effort inside the brain, with dopamine acting as one of the quieter coordinators. Because this process is slow, it can be easy to overlook. Learning often happens beneath awareness. One day, a behaviour simply feels automatic. A task that once required focus now happens without effort. The brain has absorbed the pattern, and dopamine has done much of its work behind the scenes. This quiet efficiency can sometimes be surprising. People often assume that strong motivation or intense emotion is required for learning. In reality, consistency matters far more. Small, repeated actions reshape the brain more reliably than rare bursts of enthusiasm. There is a subtle reassurance in this. It means that learning does not depend on feeling inspired every time. It depends on showing up again and again, even when the experience feels unremarkable. Dopamine responds to the pattern, not the mood. At the same time, this explains why unhelpful behaviours can become ingrained just as easily as helpful ones. The brain does not distinguish between them at the level of learning. If a behaviour is repeated and followed by a consistent outcome, dopamine reinforces it. The system is neutral. It records what happens, not what should happen. Understanding this can soften self-criticism. Habits are not a reflection of character or willpower. They are the result of patterns learned over time. Dopamine helped build them gradually, through countless small signals that went unnoticed. Breaking or reshaping those patterns follows the same rules. New behaviours must be repeated. New outcomes must be experienced consistently. The brain needs time to update its expectations. Dopamine will not instantly reward a new path just because it is chosen intentionally. It waits for evidence. This patience is built into the system. It protects the brain from changing too quickly in response to noise or chance. Learning, after all, is about reliability. Seen this way, dopamine is less like a switch and more like a dimmer. Each repetition adjusts the light slightly, brightening some pathways and allowing others to fade. No single action determines the outcome. The pattern does. Over time, these adjustments accumulate. Behaviours strengthen, choices narrow, actions begin to feel familiar, even inevitable, not because they were decided consciously, but because the brain has learned what usually comes next. Dopamine teaches the brain quietly. It does not lecture or explain. It observes, records, and adjusts. It turns experience into expectation, and expectation into habit. And because this teaching happens slowly, gently, and persistently, it shapes behaviour in ways that feel natural rather than imposed. Learning becomes less about effortful change and more about the steady influence of repetition, guiding the brain toward what it has come to expect. In this quiet way, dopamine helps the brain learn the shape of its own world, one small pattern at a time. Much of daily life runs on autopilot. Actions unfold without deliberation. Hands move before a decision is felt. Thoughts drift toward familiar paths. By the time awareness arrives, the behaviour is already underway. These moments are often described as habits, but that word can make them sound deliberate, as though they were consciously chosen and carefully maintained. In reality, most habits form quietly, without instruction or intention. They are the natural result of a brain that prefers efficiency and reliability over constant decision-making. The brain is always looking for ways to conserve effort. When an action is repeated in a similar context and followed by a predictable outcome, the brain begins to streamline the process. Fewer resources are needed. Less attention is required. Dopamine plays a role in this shift, not by rewarding the behaviour each time, but by strengthening the pathway that leads to it. Over time, the behaviour becomes easier to initiate. The cue and the response grow closer together. The space for conscious choice narrows, not because choice has disappeared, but because the brain has learned that thinking it through is no longer necessary. This is how routines take shape. They do not arrive fully formed. They emerge gradually through repetition and familiarity. Each time the same action follows the same situation, the connection is reinforced. Dopamine supports this process by quietly adjusting which pathways are easiest to activate. Eventually, the behaviour feels automatic. What often surprises people is that this automation does not require pleasure. A habit can continue long after it stops feeling enjoyable. The brain does not check in each time to ask whether the experience was satisfying. It checks whether the pattern still holds. If the cue appears and the action follows, the pathway remains intact. This is why habits can feel strangely detached from emotion. An action may no longer feel rewarding, yet the urge to perform it still arises. The brain has learned the sequence, and dopamine helps secure it. Enjoyment was never a requirement. This can be confusing, especially when habits are discussed as if they are driven by desire alone. In reality, many habits persist because they are familiar, not because they are pleasurable. Familiarity itself reduces effort, and the brain values that efficiency. Unconscious repetition is not a flaw, it is a feature. Without it, every small decision would require attention. Every morning routine would feel new. Every learned skill would demand full focus. Automation allows the brain to reserve its resources for situations that are uncertain or novel. Consider how often actions happen without awareness. Walking a familiar route, locking a door, checking the time. These behaviours are not rehearsed consciously. They unfold because the brain has practiced them enough times to trust the outcome. Dopamine's role here is subtle. It does not push the behaviour forward with excitement. It simply maintains the strength of the pathway. Each repetition confirms that the sequence still works. The signal may be small, but it is consistent. This consistency is what gives habits their staying power. Importantly, this process is neutral. The brain does not label habits as helpful or unhelpful. It does not weigh long-term consequences or moral value. It tracks patterns. If a behaviour is repeated in a stable context, the pathway strengthens. This neutrality can feel unsettling, but it is also reassuring. It means habits are not personal failures or character traits. They are learned responses. They reflect what has been repeated, not who someone is. Because habits form beneath awareness, they often feel as though they appear suddenly. One day, a behaviour is noticed, and it seems to have been there all along. In reality, it has been building quietly, reinforced by small signals over time. The brain rarely announces that a habit is forming. It simply stops asking questions. Once a routine is established, the brain shifts into maintenance mode. Less dopamine is needed to initiate the action. Less attention is required to carry it out. The behaviour becomes part of the background rhythm of daily life. This efficiency is useful, but it can also make habits feel stubborn. When a familiar behaviour is interrupted, the brain notices the absence. The expected pattern is missing. This mismatch can create a sense of discomfort or restlessness, even if the habit itself was not especially enjoyable. That discomfort is not craving in the emotional sense. It is prediction at work. The brain expected one sequence and received another. Dopamine signalling reflects that mismatch, highlighting the change. Understanding this can soften frustration. The pull toward familiar actions is not a lack of discipline. It is the brain reacting to a broken pattern. Habits also explain why intention alone is often insufficient for change. Wanting to act differently does not immediately erase existing pathways. The brain still recognizes the old pattern as reliable. New behaviours feel awkward because they are, from the brain's perspective, unproven. Dopamine does not rush to reinforce a new routine just because it has been chosen consciously. It waits, it watches, it looks for repetition. This patience can feel discouraging, but it is also protective. It prevents the brain from changing course too quickly in response to noise, mood, or chance. Stability matters. Because habits are built on repetition rather than pleasure, they can coexist with dissatisfaction. A person can feel bored, annoyed, or indifferent and still perform the same routine. The brain is following a script it has learned to trust. This is why breaking habits often requires more than removing enjoyment. Even when pleasure fades, the pathway remains. The brain needs time and new evidence to adjust its expectations. Seen this way, habits are not rigid structures, they are ongoing predictions. As long as the pattern continues, the prediction holds. When the pattern changes consistently, the prediction updates. There is no moment when a habit suddenly disappears, it slowly loosens. Understanding how habits form before they are noticed brings a sense of gentleness to the process. It removes blame. It replaces frustration with explanation. Habits are not commands issued by the brain. They are shortcuts it has learned through experience. Dopamine supports this learning quietly without drama. It does not care whether the habit feels good or bad. It cares whether the pattern repeats. And because this system is neutral, it is also flexible. What has been learned through repetition can be reshaped through repetition as well. Not quickly, not forcefully, but gradually. as the brain encounters new patterns often enough to trust them. Habits form before awareness arrives because the brain is always learning in the background. By the time something is noticed, the learning has already taken place. Seeing this does not demand control or correction, it simply offers understanding. And understanding in itself can be a surprisingly calming place to rest. Effort is often treated as something to be endured on the way to a reward, a necessary cost, a stretch of discomfort that must be tolerated before enjoyment can begin. From that perspective, effort feels like the opposite of reward, something to be minimized or escaped whenever possible. But inside the brain, effort and reward are not always separate experiences. Under certain conditions, sustained effort begins to change how the brain signals value. Dopamine, which is so often associated with anticipation and learning, also responds to progress made over time. Not dramatic breakthroughs, but steady movement. Not sudden wins, but signs that effort is leading somewhere meaningful. This can seem counterintuitive at first. If dopamine responds strongly to novelty and surprise, why would slow, repetitive effort matter at all? The answer lies in how the brain evaluates outcomes over longer stretches of time. When effort is followed by small but consistent signs of improvement, dopamine activity reflects that pattern. The signal does not spike sharply, but it remains present, reinforcing the idea that the effort is worth continuing. This is very different from fast gratification. Quick rewards tend to produce brief surges of dopamine tied to anticipation. They arrive quickly, resolve uncertainty, and then fade. The brain registers them as complete. There is little left to learn. Once the outcome is predictable, the signal quiets. Sustained effort works on a different timescale. The outcome is not immediately known. Progress is gradual. Each step provides new information about what is possible. Dopamine responds not to the final result, but to the unfolding process. The brain begins to associate effort itself with forward movement. Over time, this association can change how effort feels. What once seemed purely draining can begin to carry a sense of direction. Not excitement exactly, not pleasure in the usual sense, but something steadier. A quiet sense that the energy being spent is not wasted. This is why effort can feel meaningful in retrospect, even if it did not feel enjoyable in the moment. While the effort was ongoing, dopamine signals were helping the brain learn that persistence led to change. Once the process is complete, that learning remains. Looking back, the brain recognizes the pattern it has absorbed, and the effort gains significance. Importantly, this does not require intensity. In fact, intensity can work against this process. When effort is overwhelming or erratic, the brain has difficulty extracting a reliable pattern. Dopamine responds best to consistency. Small actions repeated over time provide clearer signals than occasional bursts of exertion. This is why gradual progress often feels more stable than sudden success. When improvement unfolds slowly, the brain has time to integrate the relationship between effort and outcome. Dopamine activity reflects that integration, reinforcing the behaviour without dramatic peaks or crashes. There's also a timing difference. Fast gratification tends to concentrate dopamine activity before the reward arrives. The excitement is front-loaded. Once the reward is received, the signal fades. With sustained effort, dopamine activity is more evenly distributed. It accompanies the process rather than clustering around a single moment. This distribution matters. When dopamine is tied to a process rather than a payoff, motivation becomes less dependent on immediate results. Effort does not need to be constantly justified by visible rewards. The brain has learned that progress itself is informative. This does not mean effort always feels good. Often it does not. There may be boredom, resistance, or fatigue along the way. Dopamine does not erase these sensations. It simply helps the brain track whether the effort continues to produce change. When it does, the signal supports persistence quietly, without enthusiasm or urgency. Patience emerges naturally from this process, not as a virtue to be practiced, but as a byproduct of learning. As the brain becomes familiar with delayed outcomes, it grows more comfortable with waiting. Dopamine activity reflects the expectation that effort will pay off eventually, even if the payoff is not immediate. Time plays an essential role here. The brain needs repeated evidence before it adjusts its expectations. Early stages of effort often feel unrewarding because the pattern has not yet been established. Dopamine signals are cautious. They do not commit until reliability is demonstrated. This can make beginnings feel difficult. The effort has started, but the brain has not yet learned that it leads somewhere. Without that learning, motivation feels fragile. This is not a lack of discipline. It is the brain withholding judgment until it has enough data. As effort continues, something subtle can shift. The brain begins to anticipate progress itself, not a final outcome, but the next small step. Dopamine activity starts to align with continuation rather than completion. The reward becomes the sense that the process is unfolding as expected. This helps explain why stopping partway through a long effort can feel uncomfortable, even when rest is needed. The brain has learned to expect forward motion. When that motion pauses unexpectedly, prediction is interrupted. Dopamine signaling reflects that disruption, drawing attention to the pause. Again, this is not desire or craving in the usual sense. It is prediction at work. The brain has learned a pattern and is momentarily surprised when it breaks. Slow rewards also tend to feel different when they finally arrive. They're often quieter, less dramatic, more stable. The brain has already integrated much of the value during the process itself. The final outcome confirms what was learned rather than delivering a sudden surge. This can be puzzling in a culture that celebrates visible results. Why does something long works toward feel less thrilling than expected? Because the learning already happened. Dopamine did its work gradually. The future became familiar before it arrived. Understanding this helps reframe effort. It is not simply a means to an end. It is part of how the brain learns what is worth doing. When effort is sustained and consistent, dopamine helps weave it into a pattern that feels reliable. This does not turn effort into pleasure. It turns effort into something intelligible, something the brain recognizes as purposeful. There is no need to force this process or accelerate it. Dopamine does not respond well to pressure. It responds to patterns observed over time. When effort is steady and expectations are realistic, the system adapts naturally. Seen this way, effort becoming its own reward is not about enjoying struggle. It is about learning trust. Trust that energy spent today contributes to understanding tomorrow. Trust that repetition shapes expectation. Trust that progress does not always announce itself loudly. Dopamine supports this trust quietly. It does not promise excitement. It offers continuity. And in a brain that learns by comparing what was expected with what unfolds, that continuity can be enough to keep moving forward, one small step at a time. Some signals in the brain move slowly. They build over time, shaped by repetition and patience. Others arrive quickly, flash brightly, and disappear almost as soon as they are noticed. Dopamine is involved in both, but the patterns they create are very different. Fast signals tend to follow the same basic structure. Something unexpected appears. Attention snaps toward it. Anticipation rises. Dopamine activity briefly increases as the brain prepares for whatever might come next. Then the outcome arrives. Uncertainty collapses and the signal fades. The entire cycle can unfold in seconds. This kind of loop feels compelling because it is efficient. The brain receives new information quickly. Predictions are tested rapidly. Each cycle offers a small update about what might happen if the same cue appears again. From the brain's perspective, this is learning at high speed. The appeal is not the outcome itself, but the pace. Fast signals compress anticipation and resolution into a short window. The brain barely has time to settle before the next cue arrives. Dopamine responds to this rapid turnover, rising again as soon as a new possibility appears. What makes these loops feel powerful is their frequency. When signals arrive often, the brain stays in a state of readiness. Attention remains slightly forward-leaning, scanning for the next update. Dopamine activity does not spike dramatically, but it remains active enough to keep interest alive. This can create the impression of engagement, even when satisfaction is brief. The key detail is that these signals are short-lived. Because the outcome is resolved quickly, there is little time for deeper learning to take place. The brain gathers information, but the pattern rarely stabilizes. Each signal stands alone, disconnected from a larger arc of progress. As a result, the feeling that follows is often flat. The anticipation was there, the resolution happened, but nothing meaningful accumulated. Dopamine has already moved on, ready to respond to the next cue. Novelty plays a central role here. When something is new, the brain does not yet know what to expect. Predictions are uncertain, and dopamine activity reflects that uncertainty. Each new stimulus carries information simply because it has not been seen before. As soon as novelty fades, so does the signal. The brain quickly learns what to expect. Without uncertainty, there is less need for dopamine to highlight the moment. The cycle ends, not because something went wrong, but because the brain has already learned what it needs. Alerts, notifications, and rapid updates fit neatly into this pattern. Each one presents a small unknown. Is it important? Is it interesting? Does it require action? Dopamine responds to the question itself, not necessarily the answer. Once the answer is known, the signal fades. The brain is already preparing for the next question. It is important to notice that this process does not rely on pleasure. Many fast signals are neutral, or even mildly irritating. Dopamine still responds because the brain is being asked to update its predictions. The system is working as designed. This helps explain why these loops can persist even when they stop feeling satisfying. The signal is tied to uncertainty and resolution, not enjoyment. As long as new cues keep appearing, the brain remains engaged. There is no intention behind this. No part of the brain is trying to distract or overwhelm itself. It is simply responding to the structure of the environment. When information arrives rapidly and unpredictably, dopamine activity reflects that pattern. Over time, these high-frequency loops can shape expectations. The brain becomes accustomed to quick resolution. Delays feel longer. Slower processes feel quieter. This does not mean patience has disappeared. It means the prediction system has adapted to a faster rhythm. Dopamine is flexible in this way. It adjusts to the tempo of experience. When signals arrive quickly, it learns to operate on shorter timescales. When signals slow down, it can adapt again, given time and consistency. The fleeting nature of fast satisfaction can feel puzzling. Why does something so engaging leave so little behind? The answer lies in how learning accumulates. Dopamine strengthens patterns through repetition, but those patterns need space to develop. When each cycle resolves immediately, there is little opportunity for deeper associations to form. The brain learns that the signal itself is the event, not the outcome, not the meaning, just the arrival of something new. This does not make fast signals harmful or wrong. They serve a purpose. They keep attention flexible. They allow quick adaptation. They help the brain stay responsive in changing environments. Problems arise only when these loops are mistaken for sustained reward. The feeling of engagement is interpreted as fulfillment. even though the underlying learning is shallow. Dopamine does not promise satisfaction. It promises information. Because these loops rely on anticipation rather than outcome, repeating them does not restore the original feeling. The first encounter carries uncertainty. The second carries familiarity. By the 10th repetition, the brain already knows what will happen. Dopamine responds less strongly, even if attention continues to be pulled toward the cue. This fading is often misinterpreted as loss of interest or motivation. In reality, it is the brain saying that the information value has declined. The system has done its job. At this point, the urge to repeat can remain, driven by habit rather than anticipation. The pathway has been reinforced. The signal no longer excites, but it still initiates action. This is where fast loops can feel empty. The behaviour continues, but the meaning does not deepen. Dopamine keeps responding to cues, but the brain is no longer learning anything new. Importantly, none of this implies blame. The brain did not choose this pattern consciously. It adapted to the signals it encountered. Dopamine responded to frequency and uncertainty, not intention. Understanding this helps remove judgment from the experience. Feeling pulled toward a rapid stimulation is not a failure of focus or character. It is a predictable response from a system designed to notice change. The contrast with slower signals becomes clearer here. Slow processes allow uncertainty to stretch over time. Predictions evolve gradually. Dopamine activity remains present without collapsing immediately. Learning accumulates. Meaning has time to form. Fast signals collapse that process into moments. They feel vivid but brief, satisfying in flashes, but difficult to integrate into a larger sense of progress. Neither pattern is inherently better. They simply operate on different timescales. The brain moves fluidly between them, responding to what is available. When rapid cues dominate the environment, dopamine follows that rhythm. When space opens for slower patterns, the system can recalibrate. This recalibration does not happen instantly. Expectations need time to adjust. Dopamine signals change gradually as the brain gathers new evidence about how the world unfolds. Seen this way, fleeting satisfaction is not a sign that something is missing. It is a sign that the signal resolved quickly. The brain learned what it needed to know and moved on. Fast signals are alluring because they promise information now. Dopamine responds to that promise, but meaning, learning, and depth require time. They ask the brain to stay with uncertainty a little longer. Understanding the difference allows both experiences to be seen clearly, not as opposing forces, but as different expressions of the same system responding to different rhythms. Dopamine does not demand speed, it adapts to it, and when the pace changes given patience and repetition, the signal can slow as well. In that slowing, satisfaction does not arrive as a flash, it settles more quietly, and the brain, no longer rushing from one prediction to the next, has room to notice what remains when the signals fade. Dopamine does not operate only in brief bursts. Beneath the rises and falls that accompany anticipation and surprise, there is a quieter background level of activity. This baseline does not announce itself, but it shapes how strongly changes are felt. It influences what stands out, what feels engaging, and what passes by unnoticed. The idea of a baseline can be thought of as the brain's reference point. It is not a fixed number or a permanent setting. It shifts slowly over time, adjusting to patterns of experience. When stimulation is occasional and varied, the baseline remains flexible. When stimulation becomes frequent and predictable, the reference point adapts. This adaptation happens gradually. The brain is always comparing what is happening now to what has happened recently. If signals arrive often, the brain begins to expect them. What once felt noticeable becomes ordinary. Dopamine responses adjust accordingly, not because the system is failing, but because it is learning what counts as normal. This is how expectations quietly shift. When the brain grows accustomed to frequent stimulation, moments that would once have stood out begin to feel muted. Not empty exactly, but less vivid. The change is subtle enough that it often goes unnoticed at first. Attention still moves, interest still appears, but the contrast between moments feels reduced. This can be described as emotional flatness, though the phrase can sound more alarming than the experience usually is. Flatness does not mean the absence of feeling. It means fewer peaks, less variation. The emotional landscape becomes smoother, with fewer sharp rises and falls. From the brain's perspective, this makes sense. If stimulation is constant, strong reactions become inefficient. Dopamine adjusts to maintain sensitivity to change, not to maintain intensity. The baseline rises slightly so that only larger deviations stand out. This is not a sign that something is broken. It is the same process that allows the eyes to adjust to brightness, or the ears to adapt to background noise. The nervous system is designed to recalibrate. Importantly, this recalibration is reversible. Baseline shifts are not permanent states. They reflect recent patterns, not fixed traits. When the rhythm of stimulation changes, the brain updates its expectations again. Dopamine activity adjusts slowly, but it does adjust. Understanding this helps explain why periods of constant input can make quieter moments feel strangely dull. It is not that those moments lack value. It is that the brain has temporarily learned to expect more frequent signals. In the absence of those signals, the prediction system notices the difference. This noticing can feel like restlessness or mild dissatisfaction. The brain is waiting for a cue that has not yet arrived. Dopamine signaling reflects that expectation, not because something is wrong, but because a familiar pattern has paused. Over time, if the quieter pattern continues, the baseline shifts again. What once felt flat begins to feel spacious. Subtle details regain contrast. The system recalibrates to the new rhythm. This process takes time because the brain is cautious. It does not change its reference point based on a single experience. It looks for consistency. Repeated evidence is needed before expectations are updated. That caution is protective. It prevents the brain from overreacting to brief changes. It allows stability. Emotional flatness, when it appears, is often temporary. It reflects a mismatch between recent expectations and current experience. Dopamine signaling highlights that mismatch, encouraging attention to the difference. This does not require intervention or alarm. The brain is already doing what it needs to do. It is adjusting. Another common misunderstanding is the idea that baseline dopamine can be permanently depleted or exhausted. In healthy brains, this is not how the system works. Dopamine is produced, released, and regulated continuously. Baseline levels shift in response to experience, but they are not used up in the way fuel is consumed. The system is dynamic, not fragile. This distinction matters because it reframes how changes in mood or interest are interpreted. A period of reduced excitement does not mean that enjoyment is gone for good. It often means that expectations have been set high by recent patterns, and the system is in the process of recalibrating. The brain learns from contrast. When contrast decreases, so does the signal. When contrast returns, so does sensitivity. This is why baseline shifts are best understood as adaptations rather than problems. They reflect a nervous system that is responsive to its environment. The same flexibility that allows rapid engagement also allows gradual settling. From a longer view, this adaptability is reassuring. It means that no state is fixed. The brain remains capable of change, even when change feels slow. Patience is built into the system, not as a moral quality, but as a biological feature. Dopamine adjusts over days and weeks, not moments. Baseline levels follow trends, not impulses. This also explains why attempts to force change often feel ineffective. The brain does not respond to sudden commands, it responds to patterns. When the pattern shifts and remains stable, the baseline follows. Calm pacing matters here. Rapid alternation between extremes makes learning difficult. Consistency allows the brain to update its reference point with confidence. Seen this way, constant stimulation does not damage the system, it trains it. And training can be unlearned, not through effort, but through exposure to different rhythms. There is no need to push against the system or override it. The brain is already capable of recalibration. It simply needs time and reliable input. Understanding baseline shifts removes much of the anxiety surrounding changes in motivation or enjoyment. It reframes them as temporary adjustments rather than permanent losses. Dopamine is not withdrawing or retreating. It is adapting to what it has recently encountered. As patterns change, expectations follow. As expectations follow, sensitivity returns. This process unfolds quietly, beneath awareness, guided by the same learning mechanisms that shaped interest in the first place. With steady pacing and time, the baseline settles into a new balance, one that reflects the current rhythm rather than the past one. Nothing is broken, nothing is lost. The system is simply learning again. Motivation is often imagined as a pleasant force, a feeling of energy, clarity or enthusiasm that arrives and makes action feel easy. When motivation does not feel like that, it is often assumed to be missing altogether. But inside the brain, motivation rarely announces itself as enjoyment. More often, it arrives as tension, restlessness, or a subtle pull toward movement that does not feel especially comfortable. This discomfort is not a sign that something has gone wrong. It is a natural part of how motivation works. Dopamine, which helps guide motivation, is not designed to make effort feel good in the moment. Its role is to bias behaviour toward actions that have mattered before, even when those actions require energy or persistence. Motivation, from the brain's perspective, is about direction rather than pleasure. It answers the question of what to do next, not whether doing it will feel enjoyable. Because of this, motivation and enjoyment are often out of sync. Effort can rise even when interest feels low. Action can begin even when enthusiasm is absent. This can feel confusing, especially in a culture that equates motivation with excitement. In reality, motivation often feels more like pressure than pleasure. The brain senses that something needs to be done, that progress should continue, or that a pattern should be maintained. Dopamine activity reflects that sense of importance. It does not soften the effort. It simply increases the likelihood that the effort will occur. This helps explain why boredom and resistance often appear alongside motivation. When an action has become familiar, the brain no longer finds it novel or stimulating. Dopamine does not respond strongly to the experience itself. Yet the behaviour may still feel necessary because the pattern has been learned. Motivation persists, even as enjoyment fades. This is not failure. It is alignment between behaviour and expectation. Boredom in this context is not laziness or lack of engagement. It is the brain recognising that little new information is being gained. The task may still matter, but it no longer surprises. Dopamine activity reflects that familiarity, not a lack of value. Resistance often arises for a similar reason. The brain anticipates effort without immediate payoff. It predicts discomfort or monotony. Dopamine still signals that the action is worth doing, but the emotional systems register the cost. The result is a push and pull, a sense of being drawn forward while wanting to stay still. This experience is deeply human. Separating effort from enjoyment helps clarify it. Effort is the expenditure of energy. Enjoyment is a response to experience. They are governed by different systems. They can overlap, but they do not depend on each other. Motivation lives closer to effort than to enjoyment. Understanding this reduces guilt around low motivation. Feeling unmotivated does not necessarily mean that something is wrong or that a person lacks discipline. Often, it means that the brain is facing a task that is familiar, effortful, or slow to resolve. Dopamine may still be guiding behaviour, but without the emotional lift that is often expected. There is also a timing mismatch at work. Motivation often arrives before satisfaction. The brain pushes toward action based on past learning, not on how the action will feel right now. Satisfaction, if it arrives at all, tends to appear later, sometimes long after the effort is complete. Expecting motivation to feel good in advance sets up unnecessary disappointment. The system was never designed to provide that guarantee. This perspective also softens the idea of low motivation as a personal flaw. Motivation fluctuates because the brain is constantly updating its expectations. Fatigue, context, recent experiences, and uncertainty all influence how strongly dopamine signals guide behaviour. These fluctuations are normal. Periods of low motivation often coincide with reduced novelty or unclear outcomes. The brain is less certain about what lies ahead. Dopamine signals are cautious. This does not mean effort is pointless. It means the system is waiting for clearer patterns to emerge. During these periods, resistance can feel louder, tasks feel heavier, progress feels slower. The temptation is to interpret this as failure, but from the brain's perspective, it is simply a moment of recalibration. Motivation does not disappear, it quiets. Compassion matters here. Treating low motivation as something to be fixed or forced can increase tension without restoring direction. The brain does not respond well to pressure alone. It responds to patterns, consistency, and time. There is also a misconception that motivation should always lead to action. In reality, motivation can exist without immediate movement. The brain can recognize importance without acting on it right away. Rest, hesitation, and delay are not opposites of motivation. They are part of how effort is managed. Allowing space for this reduces guilt. It reframes pauses as part of the process rather than signs of failure. Gentle humour can sometimes help here, not by making light of the experience, but by acknowledging it plainly. The brain, after all, did not sign a contract promising enthusiasm. It promised learning. Motivation that does not feel good is still motivation. It is the kind that carries tasks through repetition, maintenance, and slow progress. It supports routines, commitments, and long-term patterns. It does not sparkle, but it persists. Understanding this allows motivation to be seen more clearly, not as a mood to wait for, but as a signal guiding behaviour over time. Sometimes that signal is loud and energizing. Sometimes it is quiet and uncomfortable. Both are valid. Reducing guilt around motivation means accepting its uneven nature. It means recognizing that discomfort does not invalidate effort. It means allowing boredom and resistance to exist without interpreting them as failures of character. The brain is not trying to make life enjoyable at every moment. It is trying to make behavior adaptive. Dopamine helps with that, even when the experience is not pleasant. When motivation feels heavy, it is often because the system is doing exactly what it was designed to do, guiding action through uncertainty, familiarity, and effort, without promising ease or enjoyment along the way. Seen this way, motivation becomes less of a judgment and more of a signal, a quiet indication of direction, even when the path forward does not feel especially good. Attention rarely moves at random. It may feel scattered at times, pulled in many directions without warning, but beneath that movement there is a pattern. The brain directs attention toward what it believes matters most in the moment, and dopamine plays a quiet role in shaping that belief. Rather than acting as a spotlight controlled by conscious choice, attention follows signals that suggest importance, novelty, or relevance. Dopamine helps mark those signals. When dopamine activity increases in certain circuits, the brain becomes more likely to notice whatever is associated with that change. Attention drifts toward it naturally, without effort or instruction. This does not mean dopamine commands attention directly. It does not point and insist. Instead, it adjusts probability. It increases the chance that a particular thought, sensation, or external cue will rise above the background and be noticed. Over time, these small biases shape where attention tends to settle. Novelty is one of the strongest drivers of this process. When something is new, the brain has not yet learned what to expect from it. Predictions are uncertain, and uncertainty carries information. Dopamine responds to that uncertainty by highlighting the new stimulus, making it more likely to capture attention. This is why attention is often drawn to changes in the environment. A new sound in a quiet room, a sudden movement in the corner of vision, an unexpected message or update. The brain treats these moments as potentially informative. Dopamine activity reflects that possibility, nudging attention toward the source. As familiarity grows, the effect weakens. Once the brain has learned what to expect, there is less need to highlight the stimulus. Dopamine signaling softens, and attention moves on more easily. The stimulus has become part of the background. This cycle explains why attention often feels drawn toward novelty, even when the content itself is not especially interesting. The pull is not about preference or enjoyment, it is about information value. The brain is checking for updates. Distraction in this sense is not a failure of attention, it is attention doing what it evolved to do. When attention shifts unexpectedly, it's often because dopamine has flagged something as worth checking. The brain is responding to a signal, not ignoring a goal. This reframing can be relieving. It removes the idea that attention should be perfectly controlled or fixed in place. Motivation and attention are closely linked through this system. Motivation biases behaviour towards certain actions. Attention biases perception towards certain inputs. Dopamine influences both by highlighting what seems relevant based on past learning. When motivation is strong, attention often follows easily. The brain expects that engaging with a task will lead to meaningful outcomes, so dopamine signaling supports sustained focus. When motivation is weaker or uncertain, attention becomes more flexible. The brain is more willing to scan the environment for alternative signals. This scanning is not avoidance, it is exploration. The brain constantly balances two needs. One is to focus on what is already known to matter. The other is to remain open to new information that might be more important. Dopamine helps manage this balance by adjusting how strongly attention is pulled toward novelty versus familiarity. Simple, everyday experiences illustrate this well. Consider trying to read while sitting in a familiar space. When nothing changes around you, attention can settle more easily. But introduce a new sound, a flicker of movement, or an unexpected notification, and attention shifts. The brain has detected a change and wants to know what it means. This happens even when the change turns out to be trivial. The initial pull of attention does not wait for evaluation. Dopamine responds to the uncertainty first. Assessment comes later. Because of this, attention often moves before conscious choice has time to intervene. By the time awareness notices the shift, it has already happened. This can feel frustrating, but it is not evidence of weakness. It is evidence of a fast, adaptive system. Over time, repeated signals shape attentional habits. If certain cues are encountered frequently and consistently capture attention, the brain learns that they are worth monitoring. Dopamine reinforces this learning by strengthening the pathways associated with noticing and responding to those cues. This does not require enjoyment or intention, it requires repetition. Attention can become drawn to patterns simply because they have appeared often enough to be recognized as significant. This is how familiar distractions develop. The brain has learned that these cues reliably provide information, even if that information is minimal. Importantly, dopamine does not distinguish between deep and shallow information. It responds to change, unpredictability, and learned relevance. Whether a signal carries lasting meaning is determined later by other systems. This helps explain why attention can feel fragmented during periods of uncertainty. When outcomes are unclear or patterns are unstable, dopamine signaling encourages broader scanning. The brain is searching for clues. Attention spreads rather than settles. In contrast, when the future feels predictable and familiar, attention can narrow. The brain has fewer reasons to scan widely. Dopamine supports sustained focus because the environment feels known. Neither state is better, they reflect different conditions. Avoiding productivity framing is important here, because attention is not meant to be optimized in every moment. The brain did not evolve to maintain uninterrupted focus indefinitely. It evolved to adapt to changing environments. Dopamine helps with that adaptation. When attention wanders, it is often because the brain senses that something else might matter. This does not invalidate the current task. It simply reflects competing signals. Understanding this can soften self-judgment. Losing focus does not mean caring less. It means the brain is weighing multiple possibilities. Simple metaphors can help here. Attention is less like a fixed beam and more like a current. It flows toward areas of interest shaped by the landscape beneath it. Dopamine helps shape that landscape by highlighting certain features over others. Trying to force attention against that current often increases tension. Working with it begins by understanding why it moves. Over time, attention follows what the brain has learned to expect. If engaging deeply with something has repeatedly led to meaningful outcomes, dopamine supports that pattern. Attention settles more easily. If engagement has felt unrewarding or unpredictable, attention remains restless. This does not make attention unreliable. It makes it responsive. Even distraction has a role. It allows the brain to sample the environment, update predictions, and adjust priorities. Without it, attention would become rigid and unadaptive. The key point is that attention follows the signal of relevance, not the signal of importance as defined consciously. Dopamine helps set that signal based on experience, not intention. Recognizing this brings a sense of ease. Attention does not need to be fought or corrected constantly. It can be observed and understood. When attention drifts, it is often because the brain is listening to a signal shaped by learning. Dopamine has noticed something and gently nudged perception in that direction. Attention follows the signal because that is how the brain stays informed. And once that signal changes, attention can return just as quietly, without force, guided by the same system that carried it away in the first place. Craving is often spoken about as if it needs an antagonist, a flaw in the brain, a weakness of will, a force that must be resisted, controlled, or eliminated. But when craving is viewed more closely, it turns out to be far less dramatic and far more ordinary. At its core, craving is repeated wanting, not wanting born from pleasure or even from enjoyment, but wanting shaped by learning. The brain has noticed a pattern. Something happened before. It mattered enough to be remembered. And now, when similar conditions appear, the brain prepares for that outcome again. Dopamine plays a central role in this preparation, not by creating desire from nothing, but by recalling what was learned. When a cue appears that resembles a past situation, dopamine signaling can rise, nudging attention and behaviour toward what previously followed. The feeling that emerges is craving. not as an urge to feel good, but as an expectation that something might happen. This distinction matters. Craving is not the same as liking. It does not guarantee enjoyment. In many cases, craving persists even when enjoyment has faded or disappeared entirely. The brain is not chasing pleasure. It is responding to a learned association. That association does not have to be dramatic. It can be subtle, a particular time of day, a familiar place, a certain emotional state. Over time, these cues become linked to outcomes, and dopamine helps strengthen that link. When the cue appears again, the brain leans forward. This leaning can feel urgent, but it does not imply loss of control. It implies prediction. Craving often feels uncomfortable because it sits between anticipation and outcome. The brain expects something, but it has not arrived yet. Dopamine activity reflects that gap, heightening attention and narrowing focus. The mind becomes preoccupied, not because the outcome is guaranteed to be rewarding, but because the system is waiting to see whether the prediction will be confirmed. Importantly, this process is morally neutral. The brain does not judge what it has learned. It does not ask whether the desire is sensible or appropriate. It simply recalls patterns that have held true in the past and prepares for their possible return. This neutrality is often misunderstood. Craving is treated as evidence of dependence or loss of agency, when in many cases it is simply the echo of repetition. The brain has learned that a certain sequence tends to occur, and dopamine supports that learning. Dependence, by contrast, involves additional layers. It includes physiological adaptation, changes in baseline regulation, and difficulty functioning without a substance or behaviour. Craving alone does not imply this level of entanglement. Wanting something repeatedly does not mean the brain is trapped. This clarification helps remove unnecessary alarm. Not every strong desire is a warning sign. Not every repeated urge signals something pathological. Often, it is simply the brain doing what it does best, using past experience to predict the future. Repeated wanting becomes more noticeable when the outcome is inconsistent. When a behaviour sometimes leads to a satisfying result and sometimes does not, the brain remains uncertain. Dopamine responds strongly to this uncertainty, keeping attention engaged. The craving persists because the prediction has not fully resolved. This is one reason cravings can linger even when outcomes are disappointing. The brain is still gathering data. It has not yet learned whether the pattern no longer holds. Again, there is no villain here, no malfunction, just learning in progress. Craving can also feel stronger when the outcome is delayed. The longer the gap between anticipation and resolution, the more time dopamine has to sustain attention. This does not mean the desire is deep or meaningful. It means the prediction remains open. Everyday examples are everywhere, waiting for a response, anticipating a familiar routine, reaching for something out of habit rather than need. These moments of wanting are not signs of weakness. They are reflections of a brain that has learned to expect certain sequences. Gentle humour fits naturally here, because the brain can be remarkably persistent. It will happily remind itself of a possibility long after that possibility has stopped being especially interesting. Not out of stubbornness, but out of loyalty to past data. Understanding craving as a learning signal rather than a moral failing softens the experience. It creates space between the feeling and the story often attached to it. The urge does not have to be obeyed, but it also does not have to be feared. This perspective also clarifies why trying to suppress craving directly often backfires. The brain interprets suppression as significance. Attention increases. The signal becomes louder. Dopamine does not respond well to force. It responds to patterns. When a craving is met repeatedly, the pattern strengthens. When it's ignored occasionally, nothing dramatic happens. When the broader pattern changes consistently over time, the brain updates its expectations. Dopamine adjusts. The craving fades, not because it was fought, but because the prediction no longer fits reality. This takes time because the brain is cautious. It does not discard learned associations lightly. That caution is protective. It prevents sudden changes based on limited evidence. Avoiding alarmist framing matters here. Craving is not a runaway process that inevitably leads to loss of control. It is a signal that reflects learning history. Signals can change. Understanding replaces urgency. Another common confusion arises when craving is equated with need. The body needs water, it needs rest, it needs certain nutrients. Craving operates differently. It is not a measure of necessity. It is a measure of expectation. The brain can crave something it does not need, and fail to crave something it does. This mismatch does not imply dysfunction. It reflects the difference between biological requirement and learned prediction. Desire in this sense is informational rather than directive. It suggests a possibility. It does not issue a command. This reframing can be calming. When a craving arises, it does not require immediate action or correction. It can simply be noticed. The brain is rehearsing a prediction. That rehearsal will pass. Over time, as patterns shift, cravings adjust accordingly. When cues change, when outcomes change, when repetition changes, the signal adapts. Dopamine does not cling to old patterns out of attachment. It updates when evidence accumulates. This is why understanding is more effective than control. When craving is seen clearly, without judgment or urgency, it loses much of its intensity. The brain no longer needs to amplify the signal to ensure it is noticed. Craving without a villain is simply the brain remembering what once mattered, remembering what once followed, remembering a possibility that may or may not still be relevant. There is nothing broken in that. It is a system doing exactly what it was designed to do, learning from experience and preparing for what might come next. Boredom is usually treated as something to escape, a signal that nothing worthwhile is happening, a gap that should be filled as quickly as possible. But from the brain's point of view, boredom is not an error. It is a change in signal, a quieting rather than a failure. When stimulation slows, dopamine activity changes with it. The sharp rises linked to anticipation and novelty become less frequent. The background level remains, but without strong cues pulling tension forward. The brain is no longer being asked to predict something new every moment. This state can feel unfamiliar. The brain is deeply accustomed to movement, comparison, and expectation. When those processes soften, awareness turns inward. Sensations that were previously masked by activity become more noticeable. Thoughts begin to wander. Time feels different. This is often labelled boredom. But what is really happening is neurological quiet. During rest, dopamine does not disappear. It shifts roles. Instead of highlighting external cues, it supports internal scanning. The brain reviews memories, explores associations, and rehearses possibilities without immediate direction. This wandering is not random. It is how the brain integrates experience. Stillness can feel uncomfortable because it removes structure. Without clear signals telling attention where to go, the mind floats. For a system built around prediction, this lack of direction can feel uneasy at first. The brain is used to leaning forward. When there is nothing to lean toward, it fidgets. This fidgeting often takes the form of restless thoughts. Ideas surface without invitation. Memories appear unexpectedly. Attention drifts from one internal scene to another. This is not distraction. It is the brain operating in a different mode. In this quieter state, dopamine activity becomes more diffuse. Instead of sharp signals tied to specific cues, There is a gentle background influence that allows thoughts to move freely. The brain is not chasing outcomes, it is exploring. Boredom, then, is not emptiness, it is space. Space can feel uncomfortable if it is unfamiliar. When the brain has spent long periods responding to frequent signals, stillness feels like a drop in intensity. The contrast can be mistaken for something missing, but nothing has been taken away. The system is simply recalibrating. This is why boredom often appears alongside rest. When external demands fall away, the brain shifts inward. Without clear tasks or goals, dopamine no longer needs to push attention in a particular direction. The result is a softer, less focused state. There is value in this softness. During periods of rest, the brain consolidates learning. Patterns formed during active periods are replayed and refined. Connections are strengthened quietly. This process does not require concentration or effort. It unfolds naturally when stimulation is low. Stillness also allows subtle signals to be noticed. Bodily sensations, emotional undercurrents, and faint thoughts that would normally be drowned out can rise into awareness. This can feel strange, especially if one is used to constant engagement. But it is part of how the brain maintains balance. Wandering thoughts are a sign that the system is functioning as intended. The mind moves freely because it is not being constrained by immediate demands. Dopamine supports this by loosening its grip on specific predictions, allowing attention to roam. This roaming is not aimless. Even when it seems unfocused, the brain is testing ideas, connecting experiences, and exploring possibilities. Creativity, insight, and emotional processing often emerge from these quieter states. The discomfort that sometimes accompanies boredom comes from expectation. If rest is expected to feel pleasant or soothing immediately, the initial unease can feel like failure. In reality, stillness often feels awkward before it feels calming. The brain needs time to adjust. This adjustment is gradual. As the system settles into a slower rhythm, the urge for constant stimulation weakens. Dopamine activity adapts, becoming less reactive and more stable. What once felt flat can begin to feel spacious. Importantly, this does not mean that boredom should be forced or endured as a test. It simply means that when it arises naturally, it does not need to be resisted. The brain knows how to use quiet time, even if awareness is not yet comfortable with it. Gentle humour can help here, because the brain has a habit of complaining when it is given nothing specific to do. It will present a list of reasons why this moment could be improved, often within seconds. This is not sabotage. It is prediction looking for work. Normalizing this makes rest less intimidating. Wandering thoughts are not interruptions. They are the activity of a resting brain. Dopamine's behaviour during these periods reflects a shift from urgency to openness. Without strong cues demanding action, the signal relaxes. Attention becomes less tethered. The brain is free to drift. Over time, this drifting can feel grounding rather than unsettling. As expectations adjust, stillness becomes less noticeable. The absence of constant signals no longer registers as a loss. It becomes the new reference point. This is one reason why people often report that rest feels deeper after sustained quiet. The brain has recalibrated its baseline. Subtle experiences regain contrast. Small sensations feel richer. Boredom, reframed this way, is not something to fix. It is a transition, a doorway between stimulation and rest, a sign that the brain is shifting modes. Understanding this reduces the impulse to fill every quiet moment. It allows rest to unfold without pressure. The brain does not need to be entertained constantly to function well. It needs variation. Stillness provides that variation. When the mind wanders, it is not wasting time. It is reorganizing. It is making sense of what has already happened and preparing gently for what might come next. Dopamine supports this process by stepping back from sharp signaling and allowing broader patterns to surface. Creating a spacious atmosphere means allowing this to happen without judgment. There is no need to monitor the quality of rest or the content of thoughts. The brain is capable of handling quiet. Over time, boredom softens into calm, not because stimulation returns, but because the system has adjusted. What once felt like emptiness reveals itself as room to breathe. In that space, the mind is not pulled forward or pushed away. It simply exists, attentive without urgency. And for a brain that spends so much of its time predicting the future, that quiet presence is not a failure of function. It is rest doing its work. Dopamine signals are not all the same. Some help the brain learn patterns that unfold over time, gradually building understanding and stability. Others loop tightly, repeating the same cycle again and again without much change. Both emerge from the same system, and neither carries an inherent moral label. They simply reflect different relationships between time, expectation, and outcome. A useful signal is one that continues to teach. It remains informative across repetitions. Each time the brain engages with it, something new is learned, even if the change is small. Progress may be slow, but it accumulates. Dopamine activity in these patterns tends to be steady rather than sharp, responding to gradual improvement and sustained effort rather than sudden resolution. An endless loop, by contrast, resolves quickly and repeats often. The brain receives the signal, updates its prediction, and then encounters the same situation again with little variation. Dopamine still responds because the cue appears and the system has learned to expect something to follow. But the information content is low. Nothing new is being added. This difference has nothing to do with willpower or intention. It is about how learning unfolds. When a pattern stretches across time, dopamine has room to adjust expectations slowly. The brain can notice subtle changes. Effort becomes meaningful because it leads somewhere slightly different each time. The signal remains useful because the future is still being shaped. When a pattern collapses into the same short cycle, the brain learns it quickly. The uncertainty disappears. Dopamine activity fades in intensity, even if the behaviour continues. The loop remains active, but it no longer teaches. This is where the experience can begin to feel thin. Not wrong, just repetitive. Endless loops are not failures of the system. They are what happens when the brain encounters reliable, fast-resolving patterns. From a learning perspective, the system has done its job. It has identified what happens and encoded it. There's no reason for dopamine to remain strongly engaged. Sustainable patterns, on the other hand, are often slower and less obvious. They involve effort that does not resolve immediately. Outcomes are delayed. Feedback arrives gradually. Dopamine responds by supporting persistence rather than excitement. The signal does not spike, but it doesn't vanish either. Time is the key difference. When learning unfolds over longer timescales, dopamine activity remains relevant. Each repetition still carries uncertainty. The brain is still adjusting its model. Meaning emerges not from intensity, but from accumulation. This does not mean that slow patterns are always preferable, or that fast ones should be avoided. The brain uses both. Quick loops allow rapid adaptation. Slow patterns allow deeper learning. Problems arise only when one is mistaken for the other. Endless loops can feel unsatisfying when they are expected to provide meaning. They were never designed for that. They provide information quickly and efficiently, then move on. Asking them to deliver depth is like asking a snapshot to tell a long story. Sustainable signals feel different because they are embedded in time. Effort is part of the learning. Repetition adds texture rather than redundancy. Dopamine supports this by reinforcing the relationship between persistence and gradual change. Meaning in this sense is not something dopamine produces directly. It emerges when patterns align with time and effort in a way the brain can integrate. Dopamine helps mark the path, but the sense of meaning develops through accumulation. This distinction can be observed without judgment. It does not require categorizing behaviors as good or bad. It simply involves noticing whether a pattern continues to teach, or whether it has begun to repeat without variation. When a loop no longer teaches, the brain still responds out of habit. Dopamine signaling may be smaller, but the pathway remains active. The behavior continues because it is familiar, not because it is informative. Again, there is no villain here. The system is consistent. What often changes is expectation. When a familiar loop no longer provides the feeling it once did, disappointment can arise. The assumption was that repeating the pattern would restore the original experience. Dopamine does not work that way. Once the prediction is settled, the signal moves on. Sustainable patterns rarely produce dramatic peaks. They offer something quieter, a sense of continuity, a feeling that effort connects to outcome, even if that connection is not immediately rewarding. Dopamine supports this by maintaining engagement without demanding constant novelty. This can feel subtle enough to be overlooked. In a world filled with fast signals, slow learning does not announce itself loudly. It unfolds in the background, shaping behavior and expectation without spectacle. Observing this difference does not require correction or intervention. It simply requires noticing how different patterns feel over time, not in the moment, but across repetition. Endless loops often feel compelling at first and flat later. Sustainable patterns often feel unremarkable at first and steadier later. The timeline matters. This perspective removes urgency. There's no need to eliminate loops or chase sustainability. The brain already adapts. When a pattern stops providing information, dopamine signaling adjusts. Interest wanes naturally. Attention drifts. When a pattern continues to teach, the system stays engaged. Not with excitement, but with persistence. Meaning grows in that persistence. Not because dopamine demands it, but because the brain has learned that effort over time leads to change. That learning becomes part of expectation. The future begins to feel connected to the present. This connection is what differentiates a useful signal from an endless loop. One continues to refine the brain's understanding of what is possible. The other has already delivered all the information it has. Neither is wrong. They simply occupy different roles. Viewing them this way allows the system to be seen clearly, without judgment or pressure. Dopamine is not pushing toward one pattern or away from another. It is responding to what unfolds. Useful signals remain useful because they evolve. Endless loops persist because they repeat. Time reveals the difference. And with time, the brain adjusts on its own, guided by the same learning mechanisms that have been at work all along, quietly shaping behavior without instruction, correction, or blame. Understanding the brain often comes with an unexpected temptation. Once something is explained, there is a quiet urge to manage it, to optimise, to step in and take control. Dopamine, because of its influence on motivation and desire, is especially prone to this response. If it shapes behaviour, then surely it should be guided, restrained, or directed more carefully. But the brain does not respond well to being wrestled. Awareness and control are not the same thing. Awareness brings clarity. Control introduces tension. Dopamine systems, built to learn from patterns over time, react poorly to forceful intervention. They do not respond to rules or commands. They respond to experience. This is why fighting dopamine often backfires. When behavior is framed as something that must be suppressed or overridden, attention becomes narrowly focused on the very thing being resisted. The brain treats that focus as significance. Dopamine activity increases, not because the behaviour is being reinforced intentionally, but because the system has learned that this pattern now matters. Suppression sends a signal, not the signal intended, but a signal nonetheless. The brain does not hear internal instructions the way language-based thought does. It hears repetition, emphasis, and emotional charge. When a behaviour becomes the centre of effortful resistance, it is marked as important. Dopamine responds accordingly. This can feel frustrating. The harder control is applied, the louder the signal becomes. The experience is often interpreted as failure of discipline or self-regulation. In reality, it is the learning system doing exactly what it was designed to do, amplifying what appears significant. Understanding this changes the role of awareness. Awareness is not meant to silence dopamine, it is meant to observe it, to notice how signals rise and fall, to see patterns without immediately acting on them or pushing them away. This kind of awareness does not strengthen the signal, it allows it to pass. Curiosity plays a crucial role here. Curiosity keeps attention open rather than narrow. Instead of asking how to stop a feeling, curiosity asks what the feeling is doing, where it came from, how it changes over time. Dopamine systems respond to this openness differently. Without pressure, the signal does not need to escalate. This is why curiosity is often more effective than discipline. Discipline implies enforcement. It suggests that something is wrong and must be corrected. Curiosity implies interest. It allows the system to reveal itself without resistance. The brain relaxes when it is not being judged. Gentleness matters for the same reason. The nervous system is sensitive to threat, including internal threat. Harsh self-talk, urgency, and self-criticism register as stress. Dopamine does not quiet under stress. It sharpens. Attention narrows. Patterns become more rigid. Gentleness widens the field. When the brain feels safe, it is more flexible. Patterns loosen. Signals fade more easily. Learning continues without friction. This is not softness as avoidance. It is softness as conditions for change. One of the most reassuring truths about dopamine is that it updates naturally. It does not need to be forced to learn. When patterns change consistently, dopamine adapts. When expectations are no longer met, the signal adjusts. This happens whether or not there is conscious effort to intervene. Trying to control dopamine often comes from the belief that awareness must lead to immediate change. But the brain does not work on command timelines. It works on exposure and repetition. Understanding accelerates nothing. It simply removes confusion. This removal of confusion is powerful when behaviour is seen clearly, without the need to label it as good or bad. The emotional charge around it decreases. Dopamine responds less strongly when attention is calm and observational. The signal does not disappear, but it becomes less demanding. This is why noticing an urge without acting on it or suppressing it can feel strangely effective. The brain expected resistance or reinforcement. It received neither. The prediction did not resolve in the usual way. Over time, the pattern loses strength. Again, not through control but through learning. Self-compassion supports this process. Compassion reduces threat. It tells the nervous system that nothing urgent needs to be fixed. Dopamine signals become quieter when urgency drops. The system no longer needs to push attention toward immediate resolution. It is important to say this clearly. Gentleness is not passivity. Curiosity is not avoidance. Understanding is not indulgence. These approaches do not mean that behaviour never changes. They mean that change happens without struggle. The brain learns best in low-pressure environments. This is true of children learning language, adults learning skills, and nervous systems adapting to new patterns. Stress narrows learning. Safety expands it. When dopamine is treated as an enemy to be defeated, the system becomes defensive. When it is treated as information to be understood, it becomes cooperative. There's also relief in recognizing that not every signal needs to be acted on. Dopamine can suggest without commanding. An urge can arise and pass without meaning anything more than a learned association surfacing briefly. Allowing that movement reduces the sense of obligation. Understanding creates distance. Not distance from experience, but distance from compulsion. The signal is seen as a signal, not a verdict. This perspective is calming because it restores choice without force. Many people fear that without control behaviour will spiral, that without discipline nothing will change. But dopamine systems are already self-correcting. They respond to consistency, not intensity. Gentle shifts repeated over time reshape patterns more reliably than dramatic interventions. This is not something that must be remembered constantly. The brain does not need reminders. It needs experience. When experience changes, learning follows. Understanding simply allows experience to change without resistance. It also allows moments of difficulty to be met without alarm. A strong urge, a restless period, a familiar loop does not mean progress has been undone. It means the system is expressing a learned pattern. Patterns surface before they fade. This is part of the process, not a setback. Gentleness toward oneself keeps the system open during these moments. Harshness closes it. There is a quiet confidence that comes from this approach. Confidence not in control, but in adaptability. The brain has learned countless patterns across a lifetime. It can learn new ones. It does not need to be forced. Curiosity asks simple questions. What is happening? What usually follows? What changes if nothing is done? These questions are not interrogations. They are invitations. Over time, this way of relating to dopamine reduces fear. Signals lose their power to intimidate. Behaviour becomes less charged. Understanding replaces urgency. This does not mean that desire disappears. It means desire becomes easier to hold. It becomes something that can be noticed, felt, and allowed to move without immediate response. That is a form of freedom, though it rarely announces itself as such. Understanding without trying to control is not a technique. It is a stance, a way of standing beside the brain rather than against it. Watching patterns unfold without grabbing them or pushing them away. Dopamine continues to do its work in this space. It learns, it updates, it adjusts, quietly. And in that quiet there is reassurance. Nothing needs to be forced. Nothing needs to be fixed in a hurry. The system is not broken. It is learning, as it always has. Understanding is enough to let that learning continue. Dopamine is often spoken about as if it were in charge, as if it sits somewhere in the brain issuing instructions, pulling behaviour in one direction or another, deciding what happens next. From that perspective, it can feel like a ruler, measuring desire, enforcing motivation, and deciding what is pursued. But that picture gives dopamine far too much authority. What dopamine actually does is quieter and more subtle. It does not command behaviour. It does not make choices. It does not decide what matters in any deep or personal sense. It signals. It guides. It reflects what the brain has learned so far and offers suggestions based on that learning. Throughout this journey, a pattern has emerged. Dopamine responds to anticipation rather than outcome. It adjusts to repetition rather than intensity. It learns slowly through experience and updates cautiously over time. Motivation rises not because something feels good, but because the brain expects that action may lead somewhere. Desire persists not because pleasure is guaranteed, but because a pattern once held true. Seen together, motivation, learning, and desire are not separate forces pulling in different directions. They are different expressions of the same underlying process. The brain is constantly predicting the future based on the past, and dopamine helps shape those predictions. Motivation is the pull toward action when the brain expects progress. Learning is the adjustment of that expectation when outcomes differ from what was predicted. Desire is the felt anticipation that arises when the future is still uncertain. Dopamine weaves through all three, not as a driver, but as a guide. A guide does not force movement, it points. This distinction matters because it restores a sense of space. If dopamine were truly in control, behaviour would be automatic and rigid. But behaviour is flexible. Patterns can change, expectations can update. New learning can take place. Dopamine supports these changes when experience provides consistent evidence. Choice emerges here, not as an act of willpower imposed on the brain, but as a natural outcome of understanding. When signals are seen clearly, they lose some of their urgency. When patterns are recognized, they become less mysterious. The brain no longer needs to shout to be heard. Understanding does not override dopamine. It changes how dopamine is interpreted. An urge can arise without becoming an order. A pull toward action can be noticed without being obeyed immediately. Motivation can exist without being pleasant. Desire can pass without being satisfied. None of this requires suppression or control. It requires awareness. This awareness creates room for choice, not by silencing the signal, but by placing it in context. Dopamine says, based on what has happened before, this might matter. It does not say, this must happen now. When that difference is felt, behaviour becomes less reactive. Actions are no longer taken simply because a signal appeared. They are taken, or not taken, with a sense of proportion. The signal is one piece of information among many. This is not a dramatic shift. It does not arrive with certainty or resolution. It is subtle. A slight pause, a moment of recognition, a quiet sense that a feeling does not require immediate response. Over time, these moments accumulate. The brain learns that not every signal leads to action. Dopamine adjusts accordingly. Patterns soften. The guide recalibrates. This is how understanding reshapes behaviour without force. It is also how self-trust develops. When the brain sees that awareness does not lead to threat or suppression, it becomes less defensive. Signals become less intense. The system relaxes. Learning continues. This reframing also removes much of the fear around dopamine. If it is not a ruler, it does not need to be dethroned. If it is not an enemy, it does not need to be fought. It is part of the brain's navigation system, offering directions based on previous maps. Those maps are not permanent, they are updated constantly. When experience changes, dopamine changes with it. When expectations are no longer met, the signal fades. When new patterns appear consistently, the signal follows. This adaptability is built in. It does not require micromanagement. Meaning emerges naturally here, not as something dopamine provides, but as something the brain constructs over time, when effort, learning, and expectation align. Dopamine helps mark the path, but meaning grows through accumulation and integration. This is why so many experiences that feel meaningful are not immediately pleasurable. They unfold slowly. They ask for patience. Dopamine supports them quietly by reinforcing continuation rather than excitement. Fast signals, slow signals, desire, boredom, motivation, rest. All of these states coexist within the same system. None of them are mistakes. They reflect different phases of learning and prediction. Understanding this allows them to be met without urgency. A restless moment does not mean something is wrong. A flat moment does not mean something is missing. A strong desire does not mean something must be acted on. These experiences are signals, not commands. Dopamine guides attention toward what might matter based on the past. Awareness allows the present to decide. This is where choice lives, not in controlling the signal but in responding to it with perspective. The brain offers information, experience offers context, behaviour emerges from the conversation between the two. Preparing for close does not require a conclusion in the usual sense. There is no final lesson here, no rule to apply, no behaviour to adopt. The point is not to arrive somewhere different, but to see where you already are more clearly. Dopamine will continue to rise and fall. Motivation will fluctuate. Desire will appear and fade. Habits will strengthen and loosen. None of this stops. What can change is the relationship to these signals. When dopamine is seen as a guide rather than a ruler, its influence feels less absolute. It becomes one voice among many, offering suggestions based on history rather than demands about the future. This perspective is gentle by nature. It does not require constant attention. It does not need to be remembered perfectly. Even forgetting it is part of learning. The brain will encounter the same patterns again and again, each time with slightly more context. Over time, understanding settles in quietly. It does not announce itself. It shows up as less tension, less urgency, more room to pause. Behaviour shifts not because it is forced, but because it no longer needs to be pushed so hard. The system continues to function as it always has, learning from experience, updating predictions, guiding attention. But now it does so in a landscape that feels less crowded by misunderstanding. Dopamine remains what it has always been, a chemical messenger, a learning signal, a quiet guide, not a ruler, and in that distinction there is space. Space to notice, space to choose, space to let signals come and go without fear. As this exploration draws toward a softer close, there is nothing to hold on to and nothing to resolve. The brain will keep doing its work, whether it is being observed or not. Understanding simply makes that work easier to live with. And sometimes that is enough. Dopamine has been described in many ways, as a reward, as a trap, as a force that must be managed or mastered. But when all the layers are gently peeled back, what remains is something far quieter. Dopamine is not a verdict on behaviour. It is not a judgment about character. It is not a measure of worth, discipline, or success. It is a learning signal, moving through the brain, shaped by experience, responding to patterns that have unfolded over time. Throughout this exploration, one idea has returned again and again. Dopamine does not command. It suggests. It does not decide. It reflects. It does not push life forward on its own. It simply highlights what the brain has learned might matter based on what came before. Seen this way, many experiences that once felt confusing begin to soften. The restlessness that appears without a clear reason. The motivation that feels heavy rather than energizing. The pull toward familiar loops that no longer satisfy. The flatness that sometimes follows constant stimulation. None of these are signs that something has gone wrong. They are signs that learning is happening. The brain is always adjusting, always updating its expectations, always comparing what it thought would happen with what actually did. Dopamine supports that process quietly, without commentary, without concern for how the experience feels in the moment. This can be reassuring. It means that nothing needs to be fixed in a hurry. Nothing needs to be optimized or corrected aggressively. There is no ideal dopamine level to achieve, no perfect motivational state to maintain. The system is already doing its work, adapting continuously to the rhythms of life. Understanding replaces urgency. When behaviour is seen as the outcome of learning rather than failure, guilt loses its grip. When desire is understood as anticipation rather than weakness, it becomes less threatening. When boredom is recognised as quiet rather than emptiness, it becomes easier to sit with. When motivation feels uncomfortable, it no longer needs to be dismissed or forced into enthusiasm. Nothing here requires control. In fact, much of what has been explored points in the opposite direction. Trying to dominate or suppress these signals often adds tension without bringing clarity. The brain does not learn best under pressure. It learns best through consistency, safety, and time. Understanding offers that safety. It allows signals to arise without being treated as commands. It allows urges to pass without being feared. It allows patterns to be noticed without being judged. In that space, behaviour can change naturally, not because it is forced to, but because the learning context has shifted. Optimization promises certainty. Understanding offers perspective. Optimization suggests that there is a correct state to reach, a final arrangement where motivation is steady, desire is appropriate, and satisfaction is reliable. The brain does not operate in that way. It moves, it fluctuates, it adapts, it learns in cycles rather than straight lines. Understanding accepts that movement. It does not try to flatten experience into something manageable. It allows complexity to exist without immediately trying to resolve it. This is not resignation. It is trust in a system that has evolved to learn from experience rather than obey instructions. Dopamine's influence is quiet precisely because it is constant. It does not appear only in moments of excitement or craving. It is present in effort, in waiting, in repetition, in rest. It shapes attention subtly, nudging it toward what seems relevant, then letting it drift when relevance fades. This quiet influence is easy to overlook. When something feels intense, dopamine is often blamed. When something feels dull, it is often suspected to be missing. But dopamine is there in both cases, adjusting, recalibrating, responding to patterns that extend beyond any single moment. Recognizing this can be grounding. It shifts focus away from chasing particular feelings and toward noticing how experience unfolds over time. It encourages patience, not as a virtue, but as a natural consequence of how learning works. The brain does not rush to conclusions. It waits for evidence, and evidence accumulates slowly, meaning to accumulate slowly. It is rarely delivered in flashes. It grows through effort that continues even when enjoyment fades, through patterns that teach over time rather than entertain in moments. Dopamine helps support those patterns, not by creating meaning, but by reinforcing the paths that allow meaning to emerge. There is no requirement here to remember everything that has been said. Understanding does not depend on recall. It depends on exposure. Ideas settle gradually, often resurfacing later in quieter moments, reshaped by experience. Reflection does not need to produce answers. It can simply leave questions open. How does anticipation feel in daily life? When does effort feel heavy, and when does it feel purposeful? Which patterns continue to teach, and which simply repeat? These are not questions to solve, only to notice. The brain will do the rest on its own. As this exploration comes to a close, there is no final instruction to follow, no behaviour to adopt, no signal to suppress or amplify. Dopamine will continue to rise and fall. Motivation will come and go. Desire will appear and fade. Attention will drift and return. Habits will strengthen and loosen. All of this is normal. Nothing here suggests that life should feel smooth or settled all the time. The brain is not designed for permanent satisfaction. It is designed for learning, adapting, and responding to change. Dopamine supports that design quietly, without concern for how tidy the experience feels. What can change is the relationship to that process. When dopamine is understood rather than feared, its influence feels less absolute. When learning is recognized rather than judged, behavior feels less personal and more understandable. When experience is allowed to fluctuate without constant evaluation, the nervous system relaxes. That relaxation does not solve everything, but it creates space to pause before reacting, space to notice without correcting, space to let signals come and go without attaching meaning to every rise and fall. In that space, life feels a little less demanding, even when it remains complex. The brain will continue to guide attention toward what it has learned might matter. Awareness simply allows that guidance to be received without being mistaken for instruction. Dopamine remains what it has always been, a messenger, a marker of learning, a quiet influence shaped by time and experience. Nothing is broken, nothing is missing. The system is doing its work, patiently, continuously, whether it is being watched or not. As this moment settles, there is no need to carry anything forward deliberately. Let the ideas drift where they will. Let attention soften. Let the brain return to its own rhythms. Understanding does not need to be held tightly to be useful. Sometimes it is enough to know that the signals guiding life are quieter, kinder, and more adaptable than they often appear. And that, for now, can be a comforting place to rest.